Still, something was off. Neighbors recalled hearing strange noises during the night, a series of dull, rhythmic thuds. One even thought it sounded like muffled shouting, but nothing ever followed, and nothing seemed worth reporting, at least not until later. To fully understand what would soon unfold, one had to look beneath the surface, at the undercurrent of tension that had slowly been rising inside the Milite household. Those who knew Maya intimately had noticed changes. She had been distant in recent weeks, increasingly withdrawn during family gatherings, texting less, smiling less. To others, she had confided that things at home were not as they seemed. The marriage, once held together by appearances, was quietly eroding. There were disagreements, then surveillance, accusations, then isolation. It wasn't the kind of abuse that left visible bruises, but it left something deeper, emotional fractures hidden under practiced smiles and public photographs. Investigators would later review message logs, journal entries, and emails, piecing together a portrait of a woman trying to reclaim control of her life while being slowly hemmed in. Maya had been researching divorce attorneys. She had begun making plans, quiet ones, careful ones. But sometimes preparing for freedom can be the most dangerous act of all. What made Maya's disappearance even more haunting was the eerie calm that followed. Her husband, Larry Milete, didn't seem frantic. In fact, his behavior was remarkably restrained. He told police that she'd simply left, gone for a walk, that she needed space, that she would return. But her purse was still there, her ID, her phone, her medication. Maya had never left her children before. She wasn't the type to abandon responsibilities. Something about Larry's version of events didn't align with the woman others knew her to be. That discrepancy between the narrative and the known was the first crack in what would become a far more disturbing case. The search began. Flyers were printed, volunteers canvassed the area, social media campaigns were launched. The community responded swiftly, driven by the sheer impossibility of her disappearance. But despite the effort, no sightings emerged, no credible tips. It was as if Maya had been erased. And then came the quiet dread that investigators are trained to recognize, when the trail goes cold before it even begins, and the most likely suspect is the one insisting everything is fine. The truth, they suspected, was still inside that house, somewhere between what was said and what was not. But houses don't talk, and neither, it seemed, would Larry Milete. Yet, silence can be its own confession. It can echo louder than words. As law enforcement prepared to move forward, they would face a chilling challenge. How do you prove a murder with no body, no crime scene, and no direct witness? The answer, as they would soon discover, was hidden not in what could be seen, but in what had been carefully made to disappear. Chula Vista had always been the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked. Tucked just southeast of San Diego, this quiet suburban neighborhood offered the illusion of order. Rows of neatly trimmed lawns, identical rooftops basking under California skies, and families who nodded politely at one another while unloading groceries from SUVs. It was the kind of environment where nothing truly terrible was expected to happen, until it did. The Milite residence stood modestly among these rows. From the outside, there was nothing to distinguish it from the others. Pale stucco walls, trimmed hedges, a driveway where a black SUV was parked, almost ritualistically in the same position every morning. If anyone had looked closely enough, they might have noticed the house seemed too still, not empty, but paused, like a stage before a play, waiting for its tragedy to begin. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't a scream. There were no broken windows, no signs of forced entry, and no early morning sirens echoing down the cul-de-sac. Instead, it started with silence, the absence of a response to a phone call, then another, and another. Maya Milite wasn't the type to go silent. A civilian contractor with the U.S. Navy and mother of 3 young children, Maya had built a life defined by order and responsibility. To friends, she was vibrant, grounded, someone who managed both career and motherhood with sharp precision. She was the kind of person who didn't just vanish. Yet on that day, she did. Her phone was left behind. Her car remained parked in the driveway. Her wallet, Idaho, and keys were still inside the house. Her children were home, but she was gone. For those who knew Maya, the silence was deafening. The family had planned a trip. A birthday was approaching. Her sister tried calling multiple times, no answer. At first, worry settled slowly, disguised as rational thought. Maybe Maya was tired. Maybe she needed space. Maybe her phone had died. But by the time the hours turned into a full day, Concern morphed into urgency. Inside the house, nothing seemed disturbed. No signs of a break-in, no struggle. It looked like any other day. But investigators would later say it was precisely the ordinariness of the scene that made it so unnerving. The absence of chaos didn't imply peace. It suggested something more calculated. People don't disappear from their own homes without a trace, not in real life. And yet, Maya had. From a procedural standpoint, the early hours of any missing person case are critical. But the initial police response was cautious, almost reserved. There were no immediate signs of foul play, no forced entry, no blood, no note. It was as if Maya had stepped out for a moment and simply never returned. Maya was not naive. She was educated, self-aware, and deliberate. But control isn't always about intelligence. It's about proximity and pressure. And sometimes it's about isolation. What made the situation all the more concerning was what Maya had reportedly shared just days before she vanished. In one message, she confided that if anything happened to her, the people closest to her should start with him. It was a chilling line, easily dismissed as frustration in another context, but in this one, it would later become a focal point. Still, caution is not confirmation. Investigators cannot act on suggestion or speculation. They need evidence, patterns, facts, and at this point they had none. No crime scene, no physical struggle, no confirmed witness of any wrongdoing. Just a woman who was gone and a family left in the wake of her absence. What followed was a slow, methodical peeling back of layers. The house was searched, the backyard combed, canines were brought in, forensic teams swept for biological evidence. But the home gave up nothing, no blood, no broken furniture, no fibers out of place. It was immaculate, too immaculate. One of the most unsettling truths in investigations like this is the recognition that some crimes are not chaotic. They are planned, precise, executed in silence, and concealed with discipline. Over time, more details emerged. Maya had expressed to her sister that she feared being followed. She was aware of being watched, sometimes even while in the house. Whether it was paranoia or reality, the fear she carried was real. She wanted to create space, to breathe, to think, but she never got that chance. The public still held hope. Vigil groups formed. Flyers were distributed. A social media campaign was launched with photos of Maya smiling beside her children. There was no shortage of volunteers, no lack of compassion, but the ground refused to give up her location. No sightings, no credible leads, just the hollow ache of not knowing. As law enforcement reviewed security footage from neighboring homes, some images became concerning. A car, a silhouette, a door that opened when no one was seen entering. None of it was definitive, but all of it suggested the same thing. Someone in that house knew more than they were saying. The home, once the symbol of their shared life, had become a vault of unanswered questions, and still the silence persisted. From the outside, the Millet family looked like a portrait of stability. They had what many would describe as the American dream, a home in a safe suburban neighborhood, 3 beautiful children, dual incomes, and an appearance of balance. But that illusion, like so many others, was paper-thin. Beneath it, there were cracks, not the kind visible in walls or windows, but the kind that erode trust, silence voices, and distort love into something else entirely. When a person vanishes without a trace, investigators are taught to go inward, not just geographically, but psychologically. They don't start with the missing. They start with the people closest to them, the spouse, the partner, the ones who claim to know them best. Because often the answers don't lie in the woods or rivers or alleys. They lie within the walls of the very home from which the person disappeared. Maya Milette's life in the months leading up to her disappearance had begun to shift in ways that were both subtle and telling. Friends noticed it first, how she no longer stayed as long at gatherings, how her smile didn't linger. Her sister recalled a change in Maya's tone during their calls. Not dramatic, but weighed down, like someone trying to sound normal while holding something heavy. She became more private, more guarded. Investigators would later review message threads and call logs, hundreds of texts exchanged with friends and siblings. Through those digital traces, Maya's voice returned, and it painted a picture not of a woman planning to abandon her family, but of one desperately trying to reclaim herself. Her messages revealed a person under pressure, not from work or parenting, but from home. She had spoken of tension, of being watched, of emotional suffocation. There were disagreements that escalated beyond reason. accusations that lacked evidence but overflowed with jealousy. What she faced wasn't loud, chaotic violence. It was persistent, quiet control, the kind that corrodes without ever needing to shout. Maya had started reaching out to divorce attorneys. She hadn't yet filed, but the intentions were real. She was gathering information, seeking advice, planning for the future, not impulsively, carefully, and that caution may have been what cost her most. For some people, divorce is a legal proceeding. For others, it's a trigger. In cases like these, law enforcement doesn't just look at what happened. They try to understand what led to it. They examine the history, the interactions, the points of conflict. Maya and her husband had been married for over a decade. They had built a family, bought a home, shared finances. They had at times appeared inseparable. But those who looked closely began to see a shift, a pattern of surveillance disguised as concern, of possessiveness masked as love. There were allegations, unconfirmed but troubling, that Maya's digital freedom had been monitored. Her emails checked, her texts scrutinized, her independence challenged. The tragedy of emotional manipulation is that it often leaves no bruises. It works through doubt, guilt, and fear. Victims learn to normalize the discomfort. They adapt, make excuses, minimize. It becomes a private burden, one carried in silence. By the third day, concern had shifted into something darker, something heavier. The kind of unease that creeps in quietly at first, then takes root like a vine twisting around the ribs. In missing person cases, the window for a hopeful resolution begins to narrow after 48 hours. Time, once an abstract notion, becomes the most aggressive enemy. Every hour that passes without new information stretches that gap between disappearance and discovery, making the odds of a safe return slimmer with each sunrise. For Maya's family, that window was already closing. The first official report didn't come immediately. Like in many missing adult cases, authorities initially held back from calling it a criminal matter. Adults, after all, are allowed to walk away if they choose. But there was something about this one, about the meticulousness of the scene, the abruptness of the vanishing, that made it feel different. No ATM withdrawals, no known mental health episode, no spontaneous behavior in the past, no arguments with anyone outside the home. It was as though the very pattern of her life had been snapped in half, severed without explanation. Her sister, who had grown increasingly desperate, filed the report herself. She had called, texted, sent messages through mutual friends, all to no avail. Maya wasn't just quiet. She had vanished from all forms of contact, and for someone as rooted in her family as Maya, that was more than a red flag. It was a blaring siren. Once the police entered the home for their initial walkthrough, they were struck by the absence of disorder. The house was clean, lived in, but eerily sterile. It didn't feel like a place someone had fled from, nor did it feel like a space recently disrupted by violence. That in itself was suspicious. Most disappearances leave behind something: a hastily packed bag, an open drawer, a phone with incomplete messages. But Maya's phone was untouched. It still sat where she always left it, unlocked, as though she had intended to return in just a moment. But she never did. It's often said in criminal investigations that people lie, but patterns don't. And when law enforcement began establishing a timeline of Maya's last known activities, that pattern slowly began to form, an invisible shape made visible only through data, behavior, and silence. The night before she disappeared, Maya had been in contact with a divorce attorney. She had also messaged a friend, expressing unease about her domestic situation. Her tone was cautious, even cryptic, but it hinted at someone making preparations, quietly and deliberately. She had reached a psychological breaking point, not a moment of impulsivity, but of clarity, the kind that arrives after months, even years of calculated endurance. The morning after, she was gone. The children were still home. There was no emergency call placed from the house. No doorbell footage showed her leaving. No neighbors recalled seeing her on foot. The car hadn't moved. And most importantly, no one, not even her closest family, had heard from her since. That was when the search escalated. Detectives began canvassing the neighborhood, knocking on doors, requesting access to private security footage. They checked local hospitals, shelters, bus terminals. They pulled data from Maya's phone, her email, her social media accounts. But the trail ended abruptly. There was no digital footprint. This kind of investigative dead end is among the most troubling. It means either the person vanished under their own volition and took every precaution to erase themselves, which is rare and nearly impossible in modern life, or someone else took those steps for them. The distinction for trained investigators is crucial. Attention turned inward, toward the people who shared the home with Maya. Interviews were conducted separately, statements collected, and with each response, inconsistencies began to emerge, nothing obvious, but enough to trigger the instinct that something was being withheld. Not all lies are spoken aloud. Some are hidden in the selective omission of truth. The person closest to Maya gave a version of events that was, on the surface, plausible. He said she left early in the morning after an argument, that she needed space, that she walked off on her own. But when asked about specifics, what time, what route, what clothes she wore, answers were vague, shifting. There were no witnesses. No cameras captured this alleged walk. No shoes were missing from her closet. And the language used to describe her departure seemed rehearsed, emotionally disconnected. Officers noted it, but they didn't act on it yet. Because in criminal investigations, timing is everything. It wasn't until the digital forensics team began reviewing data from surrounding devices that another piece of the puzzle appeared. A motion-activated camera from a neighbor's house, 3 doors down, had detected movement around the Milite home in the early hours. The timestamp didn't match the account that had been given. The camera didn't show faces or clear actions, but it showed that someone had left the house. A car was involved. The vehicle made a brief appearance in the camera's peripheral view, backing out slowly with its lights off. It wasn't enough to prove anything, but it was enough to raise more questions. Why did this person say Maya left on foot if a car left the house during that same window? Who was driving? Where did they go? No definitive answers emerged, but the tension was growing. In the days that followed, police issued a missing persons bulletin. Media coverage began to pick up. Flyers with Maya's face appeared across the community. Her disappearance was now public, and the pressure to produce answers was mounting. Friends, co-workers, relatives all came forward to speak to her character, her habits, her fears. Collectively, they described a woman who was careful, rational, and deeply committed to her children. She would not have left them. It's a refrain investigators hear often, but in Maya's case, it carried particular weight. Her children were her world. She attended every parent-teacher meeting, managed their schedules with meticulous care, and often sacrificed her own rest to ensure their well-being. Walking away without contact was not just unlikely. It was incompatible with everything she was known to be. Behind closed doors, detectives began constructing 2 parallel paths of inquiry. One, the official channel, processing the house, analyzing electronics, reviewing statements. The other, more subtle, focused on behavior, on gaps, on psychology. Because crimes, especially those that are intimate in nature, often don't erupt without signs. They build, quietly, persistently, until something snaps. And in this case, the silence screamed louder than any confession. In any criminal investigation, there comes a point where the absence of physical evidence no longer signifies innocence. It signals intention. The longer a case remains unresolved without the usual forensic signatures, the more investigators begin to suspect that the perpetrator knew exactly how to avoid leaving them behind. In the case of Maya Milete, that moment had arrived. Her sudden disappearance was now several days old. No ransom, no sightings, no transactions, not a single ping from her phone. A mother of 3, described by those closest to her as deeply responsible and devoted, had vanished without taking anything with her, not even her most basic personal effects. The home had offered no blood, no broken objects, no overt sign of a struggle. But it was precisely this unnatural order that intensified law enforcement's concerns. The San Diego County authorities, by now joined by specialized units with experience in missing persons and domestic violence, began deepening their focus on digital forensics. If there was no trace left in the physical world, then the digital one might hold the answers. They started with Maya's devices. Her mobile phone left at the house was quickly imaged for analysis. The data extracted painted the timeline with chilling clarity. Text messages, emails, and encrypted app communications revealed the internal state of a woman reaching the end of her patience. Maya had been in contact with at least 2 family law attorneys. Her language was direct but careful. She was gathering information, weighing her options. She had not yet filed for divorce, but she had clearly articulated her intent to do so. This alone might not seem significant, but paired with her messages to close friends in the days before her disappearance, a clearer emotional landscape emerged. Maya felt unsafe. not in an immediate, life-threatening way. There were no cries for help, no allegations of violence, but her unease was consistent, persistent, and expressed in multiple conversations. She believed she was being monitored. She had grown concerned that her phone and online activity were not private. She was watching what she said not because she feared judgment, but because she suspected surveillance. For investigators, this wasn't speculation. It was a red flag. As they expanded the scope of their inquiry, they turned their attention to network activity, cloud backups, and previously deleted messages. In some of these recovered files, they found fragments of conversations that had been removed shortly before her disappearance. Phrases like, "He won't let me go," and "if anything happens to me, make sure the kids are okay," took on new meaning in light of the growing uncertainty. These weren't just emotional expressions, they were warnings. But perhaps the most damning discovery didn't come from Maya's phone. It came from elsewhere. Using a search warrant, investigators retrieved browser histories, online activity logs, and cloud-based data from computers and devices associated with the household. The patterns they uncovered were deeply unsettling. Search queries from weeks and even months earlier began to paint a profile, not of a spontaneous act, but of a mentality preoccupied with control, retribution, and irreversible outcomes. Terms like spells to keep a partner from leaving, binding love spells, and ways to make someone obey you began to appear in the history. At first it seemed bizarre, unsettling perhaps, but not criminal, until those searches evolved. Over time, the tone of the searches shifted. Investigators found queries related to untraceable poisons, erasing phone data, and even locating contract services for harm. One search asked, "Can I be tracked if I turn off location?" Another, "How to make someone disappear permanently?" Alone, any of these might be explained away as curiosity, coincidence, or even dark humor. But context is everything. And in this context, a missing woman, a locked-down digital trail, and a family left without answers, they were chilling. This wasn't just a story of loss. It was becoming a case study in coercive control. Coercive control, unlike physical abuse, doesn't leave bruises, it leaves confusion, fear, silence. It is methodical, incremental, and disguised as care. The victims often struggle to articulate what they are experiencing because on the surface everything seems normal, but underneath that surface, their autonomy is slowly eroded. In interviews with friends and relatives, Maya's growing isolation came up again and again. She had stopped sharing details of her day. She changed passwords but was convinced they were being monitored. She hesitated to call from her own phone, preferring to speak from someone else's. She double-checked her surroundings before opening up, and when she finally started taking steps toward separation, she did so with intense secrecy. All of these patterns matched the behavioral profile of someone under long-term emotional and psychological siege. As investigators continued piecing together the puzzle, one more data point stood out: location history. Using cell phone tower triangulation, law enforcement mapped out the movement of devices associated with the residence on the night Maya vanished. While her phone showed no activity, another troubling sign, a second device from the household appeared to leave the area in the early morning hours and remained unaccounted for several hours. The route taken passed through areas not covered by public surveillance, and the location data was spotty, likely due to GPS being turned off during the trip. But the timing directly contradicted the narrative given to investigators. The story of a walk, a quiet departure, a voluntary absence, none of it aligned. Still, investigators had a dilemma. No eyewitness, no weapon, no body. They had a collection of troubling signs, a digital paper trail, behavioral red flags, and a disturbing vacuum of activity from the victim. But to proceed toward prosecution, they would need to build a compelling mosaic. Not just suspicion, but a structure of evidence that could withstand legal scrutiny. To do this, they began to turn to experts, specialists in digital forensics, domestic abuse patterns, and psychological profiling. This case wasn't just about what had been done. It was about how the foundation was laid, brick by brick, silence by silence. The tragedy of Maya Miletti's story was no longer only about a woman who vanished. It was about the mechanisms that allowed it to happen in plain sight. The invisible systems of control, the missed warnings, the dangerous underestimation of non-physical abuse. In many ways, her case was a mirror reflecting the broader failures in how society understands and too often ignores the escalation of coercion into something irreversible. The investigation was shifting, no longer a search for a missing person, but the pursuit of a truth buried beneath control, denial, and the calculated silence of those who knew more than they said. By the second week of Maya Milete's disappearance, the sense of quiet anxiety that had gripped the neighborhood began shifting into something sharper: urgency, the type that builds not from panic, but from recognition. Those who knew her best understood that silence, for Maya, wasn't just unusual, it was impossible. Friends were no longer speculating about whether she had left. They were beginning to ask a different question: why hadn't she come back? The search began to evolve. Up until now, it had been largely digital, an exercise in forensics, phone records, text message trails, and internet history. But when those avenues only deepened suspicion without providing resolution, investigators moved to the physical realm. What if Maya's body was out there, hidden, buried, discarded far from the neat suburban street she once called home? Ground teams were assembled, first by volunteers, then reinforced by law enforcement. Canine units trained to detect human remains were brought in. Local parks, open fields, isolated hiking trails, and backcountry roads were marked on maps and assigned to search grids. It was a methodical process, the kind that stretches human endurance and tests community faith. Hundreds of hours were spent combing terrain for any sign, any fragment, any disruption in nature that might hold the truth. But nothing was found. No clothing, no shallow grave, no scent trail that could hold. The absence of physical evidence in outdoor searches can be deceptive. California's climate, with its dry winds and rocky soil, can preserve secrets for longer than most realize. Animals, erosion, and time itself become unknowing accomplices to disappearance. Investigators knew this. They didn't read the lack of discovery as proof of innocence. They read it as another indicator that whatever happened to Maya had been planned and executed with precision. While physical search efforts continued, public attention surged. The media, initially hesitant to cover what had seemed like a private family matter, now turned its lens toward the Milite family. Images of Maya with her children circulated across news outlets and social platforms. Vigils were held. Hashtags formed. Journalists began reporting not only on the disappearance but also on the growing questions surrounding the timeline, the search history found on household devices, and the lack of public engagement from those closest to Maya. And with attention came pressure. Pressure on investigators, on the community, on the person who had, up to this point, remained relatively silent. When people vanish without a trace, the public looks for answers, and if none are given, they start constructing their own. Whispers turned into conversations. Neighbors who had once exchanged pleasantries now reviewed their own security footage. Some began to speak with reporters, recounting minor details that seemed more important in hindsight. Vehicles seen moving at odd hours, the sounds of something heavy being loaded, dogs barking with unfamiliar intensity. Alone, none of these things could stand as evidence, but together they formed a picture. One still blurry, but undeniably unsettling. Investigators leaned into that picture. They mapped out every known movement of each person inside the house in the days before and after Maya's disappearance. Vehicle GPS records were reviewed. Surveillance footage from businesses miles away was obtained. Purchases made on credit cards were scrutinized. One transaction raised eyebrows, a purchase of heavy-duty cleaning supplies. Another, a large amount of cash withdrawn just days earlier. Taken separately, they could mean nothing. Together, they deepened the mystery. What investigators began to see was not just a potential act of violence, but a lead-up marked by preparation. There were indications of planning, of staging, of attempts to erase digital footprints, and possibly more. And that level of forethought challenged one of the most persistent myths in domestic cases, that acts of violence are always born from sudden rage. In truth, many are not. Some are patient, some are quiet, some are built day by day under a veil of normalcy, until they unfold so surgically that the evidence is nearly erased. It's a phenomenon often misunderstood by the public. People expect mess. They expect confrontation, blood, broken objects, screaming. But the most dangerous acts are frequently the cleanest, the most deceptive, the kind executed by someone with time, privacy, and motive, and the understanding that the absence of evidence can be more powerful than the presence of it. Investigators recognized that this case would require something different. They couldn't rely solely on forensics. They needed to build a behavioral mosaic, one that would allow a jury, a judge, and the public to understand the why, even if the how remained out of sight. That meant turning to experts. Behavioral analysts joined the case, offering insights into psychological patterns that often precede intimate partner disappearances. They examined the evolution of control, the escalation of emotional manipulation, and the signs of anticipatory behavior, the kind of actions taken by someone preparing for a life without their spouse, not by divorce, but by disappearance. One finding stood out. Maya had begun removing personal files from shared devices. She had backed up important documents to separate storage. She had started organizing her legal and financial information. These were not the actions of someone fleeing. They were the acts of someone preparing for accountability, someone preparing to face conflict, but who never got the chance. It wasn't just what was done to her. It was what she was prevented from doing. That is the subtle brutality of psychological domination, not just the restriction of freedom, but the obstruction of exit. And in Maya's case, the data showed that when she reached the point of near escape, the silence began. Outside the Milite home, neighbors drove by more slowly now. News vans parked intermittently. Strangers stopped to take photos of the missing posters stapled to light poles. What was once a quiet neighborhood had become a symbol of something broken, not only a family, but the illusion that such tragedies happen somewhere else. They happen here, and they rarely begin with violence. They begin with silence, isolation, a slow chipping away of voice, agency, and movement. That's what makes them so difficult to stop and so easy to miss. As the weeks pressed forward, law enforcement knew one thing with certainty. This was no longer a search. It was a case, one that would require patience, precision, and the resolve to pursue truth through shadows. As the investigation into Maya Milete's disappearance entered its third week, the distinction between private and public persona became increasingly significant. Investigators often say that in missing persons cases involving domestic dynamics, the truth rarely resides in what people say aloud. It lives in the space between their words, in contradictions too small for casual observers to catch, but too loud for trained eyes to ignore. From the start, those closest to Maya had been forthcoming. Her siblings, friends, and extended family members opened their homes, handed over phones, shared messages, and relived painful memories to help build a clearer portrait of her final days. They didn't just want justice. They needed to restore a sense of reality to the hole her disappearance had torn open. But one voice stood out, not because it was loud, but because it was guarded. That guardedness became a signal of its own. Interviews with individuals who had interacted with the Milite family in the weeks prior began revealing inconsistencies. Some neighbors recalled Maya seeming tense, withdrawn, or distracted during brief encounters. One described seeing her step into the backyard late at night, pacing with a phone pressed to her ear. Another reported hearing sharp voices, muffled by walls but clearly agitated. None of these moments on their own proved anything, but they painted a portrait of an atmosphere thick with unspoken conflict. And while most of Maya's contacts reported her growing unease and desire for distance, her spouse's statements conveyed a different reality, one where Maya had simply chosen to walk away. No signs of distress, no indicators of trouble, just a voluntary absence. That explanation might have held weight in another context, but here, it collided with everything investigators were learning. Law enforcement is trained to detect shifts in narrative. The way someone recounts an event is often more telling than the content of the story itself. Over the course of multiple interviews, subtle shifts emerged in the recollection of the night Maya vanished. Timelines that had once been firm became fluid. Small details, whether she had taken her purse, what time she had last been seen, whether they argued, began to change. These weren't simple memory lapses. They were adaptive retellings, recalibrated in real time based on what investigators had discovered elsewhere. The home itself, now searched multiple times, continued to offer little in the way of direct forensic evidence. No traces of blood, no visible signs of violence. But the behavior around the home had changed. Surveillance footage from nearby homes and businesses revealed movements at odd hours, particularly in the days following Maya's disappearance. A vehicle registered to the household was seen taking multiple trips to unfamiliar locations, late at night, without clear explanation. When confronted with these findings, the responses remained vague. The trips were described as errands, drives to clear the head, or outings unrelated to the case. But when GPS data and traffic cameras were cross-referenced, the destination points lacked coherence, no receipts, no witness confirmation, just movement in the dark, followed by silence. Investigators then took a more nuanced approach, analyzing not just data, but demeanor. Psychological profiling in domestic cases is a delicate science. It involves understanding how power operates in private, how control manifests without physical violence, and how language can become a weapon all its own. Maya's communications had already indicated fear, not of an explosive act, but of ongoing restriction. She had been walking a fine line, trying to preserve her safety while preparing for a life outside the control she had come to recognize as unhealthy. Experts brought into the case began examining years' worth of patterns, public appearances, social media posts, medical records, and behavior around friends. They noticed something consistent: the gradual erosion of Maya's autonomy. She had once been socially active, outgoing, professionally driven. But over time, her presence in spaces outside the home diminished. Invitations were declined, work stress increased, photos once filled with family trips and birthdays became sparse. To an outsider, it might appear as simple burnout. But to those who understood patterns of coercive dynamics, it was a red flag. Isolation is rarely sudden. It's a slow retreat, often internalized as self-preservation. It wasn't just Maya who had changed, those around her had begun normalizing the change. That's how control takes root, not as an obvious chain, but as a shifting of normalcy. The boundary between protection and possession becomes blurry. Over time, what feels wrong becomes routine. In parallel, forensic analysts continued re-examining the home. This time, they weren't looking for obvious clues. They focused on digital residue: USB drives, deleted folders, autosaved documents, cloud backups. On a rarely used household computer, they found remnants of PDF files containing legal research, family law, child custody statutes, asset separation. Some were partially filled forms, others were blank. But their presence told a story Maya never got to finish. One discovery in particular stood out: a draft email, never sent, addressed to an attorney. In it, Maya expressed concern for her safety, not in dramatic terms, but with the precision of someone trying to build a record. She wanted custody, she wanted peace, and she feared that her desire to leave would provoke a reaction she couldn't control. She had not sent that email. Perhaps she hadn't finished it. Perhaps she hadn't gotten the chance. Back in the community, awareness of the investigation's complexity began to grow. What had once seemed like a tragic disappearance now carried the heavy weight of suspicion. But without conclusive evidence, law enforcement remained cautious. They couldn't afford a misstep. Every move had to be deliberate, strategic, and legally airtight. What Maya left behind was not just a physical absence. It was a digital fingerprint of fear, of preparation, of someone walking toward liberation, only to be cut short by forces that knew exactly how to stay hidden. As investigators deepened their probe, the image of a fractured household sharpened, not in sensationalized form, but in the real, quiet suffering that defines so many cases like this. It was the story of a woman who tried to reclaim her voice in an environment that thrived on keeping her silent, of choices made behind closed doors that would ripple far beyond them, and at the center of it all, a contradiction that could no longer be ignored. Weeks had passed. The search had grown cold, but the case had not. In the quiet spaces between fact and suspicion, investigators began to methodically rebuild the final known hours of Maya Milate's life, not through confessions or eyewitness testimony, but through fragments, data points, behavior, inconsistencies. This was no longer a search. It had become a reconstruction. Unlike many violent crimes, there had been no explosion of chaos, no 911 call, no struggle loud enough to draw attention. What made this case particularly haunting was its silence, an orchestrated stillness so precise that it had left behind almost nothing. Almost. But in forensic work, almost nothing can be everything. Using a combination of digital forensics, geolocation data, neighborhood surveillance footage, and behavioral analysis, investigators slowly began to piece together the shape of something calculated, concealed. It was not a single clue, but the convergence of details, timelines that didn't align, movement that contradicted statements, and a digital trail attempting to disappear itself. The night Maya was last heard from, she had messaged a friend about a disagreement at home. The message tone, although guarded, suggested unease. It would be her final contact. Her phone ceased activity shortly thereafter, not powered down, simply silent. At the same time, a secondary device registered movement from the Milite home, a vehicle leaving the area well before sunrise, its lights off, No destination recorded. The device that moved did not belong to Maya. Reviewing nearby security footage, investigators observed the vague silhouette of a figure outside the home during that same window, mid-frame, barely illuminated, pacing briefly before disappearing into the dark. It wasn't enough for identification, but enough to confirm movement. The narrative of a peaceful voluntary departure in the morning was unraveling. Further investigation showed that while Maya's digital presence had stopped entirely, one account associated with her spouse showed heightened activity, searches, device resets, and location pings inconsistent with prior behavior. There were searches on how long it takes for human remains to decompose in various climates. Others focused on disposal methods, legal definitions of homicide without a body, and techniques to erase location data from digital devices. These were not idle curiosities. They were blueprints. When presented with these findings, the story from inside the home began to shift. Again, the timeline was altered, the nature of the disagreement minimized. The explanation for the early morning vehicle trip revised, now described as a drive to calm down, or clear the head. No receipts, no witnesses, no destination. And then came the turning point. Law enforcement, building a circumstantial case rooted in behavioral analysis, began to examine motive more directly. Maya had been planning a formal separation. She had contacted attorneys. She had begun setting boundaries. There was documentation of her intent to request full custody of the children. She had even shared fears with friends and family about what might happen if she pursued legal action. This wasn't just a family under stress. It was a household divided between someone trying to leave and someone refusing to let go. As investigators developed their case file, they identified a clear progression. First, surveillance of Maya's digital life. Second, increasing isolation. Third, deletion of key messages and accounts. Fourth, a spike in behavior consistent with staging, purchases of heavy-duty cleaning supplies, missing household items, late-night trips, GPS-disabled routes, and unrecoverable surveillance gaps during the window of disappearance. It was enough. A decision was made by the district attorney's office, not lightly, but deliberately. Despite the absence of a body, the totality of evidence pointed to premeditation, control, and an effort to eliminate a person without leaving a trace. A warrant was signed. When law enforcement arrived to execute the arrest, the response was subdued. There was no attempt to flee, no protest of innocence, just silence. The kind investigators had come to expect. Calm on the surface, but absent of remorse or urgency. The same stillness that had clouded the case from the beginning. The charges, murder and unlawful possession of an assault weapon. Inside the home, a further search revealed unregistered firearms and ammunition, yet another layer beneath the domestic image carefully maintained for years. While not the centerpiece of the case, the weapons charge helped solidify custody and set the stage for prosecution. As the arrest was made public, the community that had once whispered now spoke with conviction. Neighbors who had remained silent began recalling details they had previously dismissed. A garage door closing too slowly, trash bins being wheeled out unusually late, the weight of a presence that never truly felt safe, though no one could name why. In the courtroom, the prosecution faced a formidable challenge, presenting a murder case without a body. But the strength of the case did not lie in one piece of damning evidence. It lay in the careful, clinical assembly of everything Maya had tried to say before she was silenced. Emails, texts, search histories, behavioral reports, timeline analysis, expert testimony on domestic control and digital suppression. Each strand was weak on its own. Together, they were unbreakable. The question posed to the jury would not be, do we know what happened in absolute terms? It would be, given everything she left behind, are we prepared to believe Maya would vanish on her own, abandon her children, and erase herself without help? That answer was becoming increasingly clear. But this case was never just about guilt or innocence. It had become a reflection of something far larger, a system where too many disappearances like Maya's go unprosecuted, unacknowledged, or unproven simply because the person is no longer present to speak. A reminder that silence can be constructed, that the absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. It was Maya's own preparation, her messages, her plans, her fears expressed quietly but consistently, that laid the foundation for truth. She had tried to be heard, and though her voice had been taken, it was that record of resistance that became the case's spine. Justice now would have to speak for her. Courtrooms have long been stages for justice, but they are also mirrors. In trials involving loss without closure, without remains, without finality, the law must weigh what it cannot see. And in the matter of the people versus Larry Maletti, the justice system was asked to do exactly that, hold someone accountable for a murder without a body. It is one of the most difficult challenges in modern criminal prosecution. Jurors are taught to expect physical evidence, a weapon, a confession, a body. But what happens when none of those are available? When the accused denies everything and the victim cannot speak? The prosecution's job then is not to fill the silence with speculation, but to let the truth emerge from what the victim left behind. The trial began under the weight of national attention. Media outlets covered the proceedings with cautious intensity. Reporters carefully avoided sensationalism, yet the case itself carried a gravity too heavy to ignore. This wasn't just about Maya Milite. It was about the thousands of women who disappear under eerily similar circumstances, only for their cases to be dismissed, their stories buried under the demand for proof that may never come. Inside the courtroom, Maya's name was repeated hundreds of times. It echoed from the mouths of prosecutors, witnesses, and experts. Her face, once a fixture in community events and school drop-offs, now hung above the jury in photographs frozen in time. Her words, retrieved from emails, texts, and digital journals, formed the backbone of the state's case. And though she could not testify, Maya spoke. The prosecution built its narrative deliberately. They presented no grand reveal, no surprise witnesses. Instead, they unfolded the case as an unrelenting series of facts, each one subtle, but each one inching closer to a single conclusion. They began with motive. Maya's documented efforts to separate herself, her children, and her future from her spouse were presented in detail. Divorce consultations, custody inquiries, financial reorganizations, texts to friends expressing fear, all documented, all time-stamped, all real. Then came the pattern of control. Experts in domestic psychological abuse testified about coercive dynamics, how victims may appear outwardly stable, but live in a reality shaped by intimidation and surveillance. Maya's friends corroborated these patterns. Her sister read from a message Maya had sent weeks before she disappeared. "If anything ever happens to me, please protect my kids." The courtroom did not react with gasps, only silence. Next came behavior. The prosecution introduced the changing timeline offered by the defendant, the unexplained early morning vehicle movements, and the lack of credible alibi during the hours Maya was last believed to be alive. They overlaid these inconsistencies with data from cell towers, missing surveillance gaps, and search histories that grew darker with time. A digital forensics expert detailed the deletion of specific files from shared devices, searches about decomposition, disposal, and legal loopholes. They explained how metadata proved those queries originated from inside the home. Then, physical absence. No bank activity, no social media login, no passport usage, no purchases, no confirmed sighting of Maya after a single night. Finally, the presence of planning, cleaning supplies, weapons, late-night drives to locations without clear purpose. A map of movement, not chaos. The defense, as expected, argued reasonable doubt. They reminded the jury there was no DNA, no eyewitnesses, no blood. They proposed that Maya had chosen to disappear, that she might be alive somewhere, that the prosecution's case was built not on what was, but what might have been. It was a calculated strategy, but it underestimated what Maya had already documented. As closing arguments began, the lead prosecutor paused before speaking. Then, with steady restraint, she said, "Maya knew something could happen to her. She feared it. She tried to prepare for it. She left us her truth, not in screams, not in a letter, but in her words, her actions, her planning. You don't need to see a body to hear a voice." The jury deliberated for days. The public waited in tense silence, and then a verdict: guilty. The charge: first-degree murder, premeditated, proven beyond reasonable doubt, without a body, without a scene, but with a story no longer in the control of its silencer. For Maya's family, the moment was not victory. There were no cheers, only tears, only the release of something they had carried for too long, the weight of believing the worst, and now having it confirmed. Her children, now living with relatives, were spared from the courtroom, but they would grow up knowing the truth, not only of what happened, but of who their mother had been, a woman who fought, documented, and dared to plan for freedom in the face of control. For the broader public, the trial became a landmark. Legal scholars would cite it as one of the rare modern convictions secured without a recovered victim. Advocates against domestic abuse called it a watershed moment, proof that psychological violence leaves behind just as much destruction as physical harm. It also served as an indictment of silence. Communities, systems, and individuals were forced to reckon with the question, how many warning signs are ignored because they are quiet? Because the bruises are invisible? Because the victim hasn't vanished yet? Maya's story will be studied not for its ending, but for its pattern, for the way she tried to speak in the only ways she could, and for the way those signs were finally, after so long, heard. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.